Good day to all of you. My task is to present on the topic Missio inter Gentes and its implications for mission theology today. Pope Francis's impetus to put synodality at the center of his ecclesiological reform puts forward his vision of a missionary church. His latest document, Predicate Evangelicum, which was published last March 19, 2022, embodies his reform for a communal church that genuinely reflects her nature as a pilgrim church of missionary character, as embodied in Gentes 2 of the Vatican II document. Undoubtedly, this thrust has implications for our practice and theology of mission. In a growing pluralistic world, this question is imperative. How should the church carry out its mission amid diversity and plurality of ideologies and cultures today? My presentation has three parts. First is the Communio Ecclesiology as fulcrum of mission theology since the Second Vatican Council. Second, the concept and development of Missio inter Gentes. And the third, the implications of Missio inter Gentes for mission theology today. Let me begin with the first one, Communio Ecclesiology and Vatican II, by looking into a glimpse of what is Communio Ecclesiology. In a society increasingly emancipated from her influence and tradition, the Second Vatican Council undertook an in-depth reflection on the nature of the Church, her essential structures, and her mission. And the fruit of this reflection is what we call the ecclesiology of communion. Alongside such theological development was Christianity's becoming a world religion, finding a home among cultures. This trend is echoed by Karl Rahner's theological reading of history, where he suggests three epochs that have shaped the development of Christianity or the world church that we have today, such as the Jewish period, the European period, and what we call now today as the world church in our time. His insights resonates with that of Walbert Bullman, where he suggests also three epochs that shape the development of Christianity, starting with the Eastern Greek, then followed by the Western Latin, and lastly, what we call now as the Southern Hemisphere Church, that is characterized by multiculturality, or what we also call as a multilingual church. The preceding insights were indicators of the post-Vatican II movements, particularly in the 1970s, which generated a new awareness that every local church is both mission sending and mission receiving. These developments situate the relevance of the renewed understanding of the Catholic Church as envisioned by the Council's ecclesiology of communion. However, the term communion could be interpreted generically, and for this we proceed by looking into some nuances of the term communion. During the Extraordinary Synod of Bishops in 1985, in the final report or final statement, it said that the ecclesiology of communion is the central spirit of the Second Vatican Council, a renewal of Catholic ecclesiology. The Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith supported such understanding, where then the head Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger said that the concept of communion or koinonia, which appears with a certain prominence in the texts of the Second Vatican Council, is very suitable for expressing the core of the mystery of the Church, and can certainly be a key for the renewal of Catholic ecclesiology. CDF, or the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, also highlighted the understanding of communion not in terms of reciprocal recognition on the part of the particular churches, but in terms of mutual interiority of these particular churches with the universal church. This means that the universal church cannot be conceived as the sum of the particular churches or as a federation of particular churches. Their relationship cannot be compared to that which exists between the whole and the parts in a purely human group. Moreover, the church as communion also means that its institutional structure is collegial rather than monarchical. It is not a single parish under the leadership of the Pope, subdivided into dioceses and parishes. It is instead a communion of local churches, each of which is the body of Christ, situated or present in a particular place. It is a communion rooted in the sanctifying presence of the Holy Spirit. This communion, therefore, underscores the traditional importance of councils, synods, and conferences of bishops in the life and structure of the Church, which is operative especially during the first Christian millennium. Now we proceed with the third point on communion as a theological concept. In the New Testament, communion or koinonia is understood in various ways. First, the breaking of the bread and praying together as found in the Acts of the Apostles. Sharing in the bread or the breaking of the bread and praying together. It's also sharing in the Eucharist and sharing in the material goods, as we see in the letter of St. Paul to the Corinthians. It also stresses the fellowship of those who walk in the light because they are in communion with the Father and the Son, and consequently with one another. First letter of John. In the church tradition, the classic formula of Imago Dei grounds the concept of communion. Created in the image of the Triune God, human beings are oriented towards communion with God and fellow human beings. This fellowship with God defines human beings and their relationship with others. Moreover, understood within the scriptural teaching and the patristic tradition, ecclesial communion always involves a double dimension, the vertical with God and the horizontal among peoples. It refers to the relationship between human beings and God, established in the person of Christ and communicated through the sacrament, extending to a new relationship among human beings. Moreover, ecclesial communion is at the same time both visible and invisible realities. Its invisible dimension is captured by the communion of the faithful sharing in the Trinitarian life. Its visible dimension is concretized in the unity making the faithful and organically structured community, endowed with suitable means for its visible and social union. We can say that the former refers to the vertical communion and the latter to the horizontal communion. The link between the invisible and visible elements of ecclesial communion constitutes the Church as the sacrament of salvation. From this sacramentality, the Church is not a reality closed in on herself. Instead, she is permanently open to missionary and ecumenical endeavors, for she is sent to the world to announce and witness, to make present and spread the mystery of communion, which is essential to her. For Catholics, the Holy Eucharist is the concrete embodiment of ecclesial communion. Vatican II rightly proclaimed the Eucharist as the source and summit of the Christian life. John Paul II said, "The Eucharist makes the Church." Orthodox theology claims that the Eucharist is the origin and summit of Christian mission. It is the action that fully expresses the fellowship that is the Church. Speaking of fellowship, Antonio Prenia notes, the primary image Jesus uses for the kingdom was table fellowship, even with the outcasts. Through this inclusive gesture, Jesus announced that God was inviting everyone without exception, inviting to communion with Him. Consequently, if Jesus, who is the very center of the Eucharist, is the missionary par excellence, such an act of communion should mirror Jesus' mission of inclusion. Every Eucharist should then be the continuation of Jesus' inclusive embodiment, demonstration, and proclamation of the kingdom. Grounded in Jesus' person, deeds, and words, such a Eucharistic communion should overflow into caring for all those in God's creation, especially those who suffer. By this, the Church becomes a credible symbol of God's presence and an effective sign that illuminates the darkness in the world. It becomes an epiphany of the kingdom that God wills for the whole of humankind. Now we proceed with the second part of my presentation on the concept and the development of the term Missio inter Gentes. Since the Second Vatican Council, the Church has witnessed the emerging and changing mission contexts that have beckoned a changing praxis and theology of mission. One of the significant shifts is from Missio ad Gentes to Missio inter Gentes. We propose that ad Gentes is the starting point for this shift. The term ad Gentes is the first word or phrase of the prominent decree of the Second Vatican Council on the missionary activity of the Church. This decree promotes openness to other traditions, cultures, and ideologies. Insights from this decree were pioneering and had far-reaching implications of the practice of dialogue in the ensuing decades after the Council. Going beyond the old theory, there is no salvation outside the Church, and this is the landmark shift of this paradigm. The idea of inclusive perception of other Christian and religious communities is undoubtedly a major credit of Missio ad Gentes. Despite everything, however, the missionary spirit of ad Gentes runs the exigency of being prone to the Jesus size of Christian mission, and we can point out here some of its shadows, such as the holier-than-thou attitude or disposition that has been displayed over the millennia. It disregards the missionary dictum that God existed among the local peoples before the missionaries arrived. Often, it results in a condescending, triumphalistic, and unidirectional monologue which tramples on the sensitivities of the non-Christians. For many years, ad Gentes had been closely bound up with Eurocentric bias. This missionary approach, which means to the peoples, is tainted with colonial, institutional, and superiority overtones. Implanting the Church is its ultimate objective. The process is oriented toward converting linguistic, cultural, and social traditions. Mission, then, is a one-way activity. Having seen Missio ad Gentes significantly lagging behind the basic orientations of the Second Vatican Council, Professor Jonathan Tan of Australian Catholic University raised criticism on its objectionable tone. He contends that ad Gentes is uncomfortable with religious pluralism, no longer useful to mission. Nonetheless, despite the so-called shadows of ad Gentes, we cannot also discount its contribution to the emergence of the inter Gentes paradigm. In a short period, numerous scholars emerged with expertise on religious philosophies and practice of other religions. Books and articles were published on the above and related themes. Seminaries and universities offered courses on different religions, interfaith dialogue, intercultural studies, and related themes. For this, Gentes deserves a share of the credit, especially for the preliminary insights it ushered in towards the emergence of the concept of intergentes. If Missio ad Gentes serves as the starting point for this paradigm shift, we also propose that Missio inter Gentes is the turning point. Missio inter Gentes is obviously preferred for its non-confrontational, dialogical approach to societies of diverse cultures, religions, histories, and traditions. It is relevant to the complex challenge of doing a Christian mission in a diverse and pluralistic world. M.D. Thomas affirms this by saying that mission inter gentes is a mission of the people, by the people, for the people, with the people, from the people, and among the people. It is not performed by one person or a few persons, but is accomplished by all the constituents of a certain grouping in a collective manner. The beneficiaries of the mission have a full share in the entire process of the mission. Mission in inter gentes is not superimposed, but is completely applied to the given context and people. Historically, the expression Missio inter gentes was first proposed by William R. Burroughs in his response to Michael Amalados's presentation entitled Pluralism of Religions and the Proclamation of Jesus Christ in the Context of Asia, which he delivered at the 56th Annual Convention of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Asian scholar Jonathan Tan, already mentioned earlier, systematically developed this concept based on the final statements of all the plenary assemblies of the FABC from 1974 to 2000. Officially approved by the Federation of Asian Bishops' Conference, it was published in FABC Papers 109 in 2004 in the article titled Missio inter gentes, Toward a New Paradigm of the Mission Theology of the Federation of the Asian Bishops' Conference. In addition, several field-based missiologists and interfaith advocates continue to explore these paradigms' diverse prospects and implications. A journal named Missio inter gentes was launched by the Divine Word Mission or Divine Word Institute of Mission Studies in Tagaytay in 2015 and is promoting research to explore the same theme. Going back to the statement of the Federations of Asian Bishops' Conferences, we quote, "A Missio inter gentes approach would be perfectly at home within the diverse and pluralistic Sitz im Leben of Asian cultures and religions. Rather than proclaiming to or add the nations in the hopes of getting them to abandon their religions in favor of the Christian gospel, the FABC bishops have chosen a mission paradigm that seeks to immerse the local churches in the diverse and pluralistic Asian Sitz im Leben, sharing life in solidarity with the Asian peoples and serving life as Jesus had done." Now, let me proceed with the third and the last part of my presentation. Missio inter Gentes, its implication to mission theology. At the very outset, I proposed that the theology of communion has been the fulcrum of mission theology since the Second Vatican Council. This theology concurs with the dynamics of Missio inter Gentes as a paradigm of mission in a highly globalized and pluralistic world like Asia. Let me now suggest 3 areas where Missio inter Gentes affirms its relevance in light of the communion theology of Vatican II. First is a renewed Catholicity. Second, a contextualized theology. And third, an intercultural theology. Cultural pliancy and adaptability mark the history of the Christian faith. This feature was evident in various contexts, such as the multicultural Mediterranean world, the vast horizon of the Roman Empire, the early century Silk Road, and the series of diaspora. The multiformity of this shared coexistence had enriched the Church's identity culturally and religiously. Today, with societies becoming multicultural, such openness to cultural diversity is a missiological imperative. Given such a feature of the early Church, we propose returning to such a spirit. Hence, the concept of renewed Catholicity is a point for renewal or ersosmoa in the Church today. Vatican II documents are replete with texts that beckon the urgency of such a renewed Catholicity in the Church. Although within the purview of the Catholic Church, a few relevant excerpts are worth citing. For instance, the Decree on Ecumenism, Unitatis Redintegratio number 4 states, and I quote, "While preserving unity in essentials, let all the members of the Church, according to the office entrusted to each, preserve proper freedom in the various forms of spiritual life and discipline, in the variety of liturgical rites, and even in the theological elaborations of revealed truth. In all things, let charity be exercised. If the faithful are true to this course of action, they will be giving ever richer expression to the authentic Catholicity of the Church, and at the same time to her apostolicity." End of quote. Gentes number 6 states, and I quote, "This mission of the Church is one and the same everywhere, and in all situations, although because of circumstances, it may not always be exercised in the same way. The differences that must be recognized in this activity of the Church do not flow from the inner nature of the mission itself, but from the circumstances in which it is exercised. These circumstances depend either on the Church itself or on the peoples, classes, or men to whom its mission is directed." End of quote. Robert Schreiter, affirming these insights mentioned, says, "The Church can only be truly Catholic if she listens to voices from different geographic and cultural contexts. In this process, marginalized groups and voices need special attention. Another scholar, Charles Taylor, said, and I quote, "Wholeness is a unity of parts rather than a suppression of them. Suppressing diversity in human cultures is not the way to unity, to true Catholicism. Catholic unity embraces differences rather than fusing differences into identity. Trinitarian life is a unity of this kind." End of quote. Contextual theology was born out of the critiques of scholars on Western forms of theological education. It called for a dialectic between the scriptures and contexts of social and cultural change, and between the local and the universal norm of the gospel. The basis of such criticism is that the gospel of Jesus Christ is multifaceted and has a much richer meaning than we can perceive from our limited historical and cultural perspective. This contextual theology or contextualized theology has given rise to the efforts of regional groups of theologians and churches to find their voices in theology. For instance, in Asia, we have theology of harmony and dialogue. In Africa, theology of enculturation. In Latin America, theology of liberation. Other forms of theology, feminine theology, and the like. Such movements of contextualization entering into the mainstream of theology were echoed in the works of several scholars. For instance, in 1985, Robert Schreiter published his work titled Constructing Local Theologies. In 1992, Stephen Bevans published his work Models of Contextual Theology. And in 2001, Scott Sundquist and Dale Irvin published their work titled History of the World Christian Movement. And lastly, in 2002, Philip Jenkins published his work titled The Next Christendom. All these works popularized what missiologists had known for decades, that Christianity was no longer captive to colonial rule, and that the local and global are inseparable in the making of Christianity as a world religion. The above authors integrated contextualization with systematic theological reflection. These developments presupposed that the entirety of the theological edifice is contextually shaped not only in Africa, Asia, Latin America, but also in Western theology, profoundly shaped by the influence of modernity and more recently, post-modernity. Now we proceed with my last proposal on how Missio inter Gentes is relevant in our mission theology for today. And that is a shift from enculturation theology to intercultural theology. Joseph Ratzinger, then head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, in 1993 addressed the Asian bishops. Let me quote what he said in line with intercultural theology or interculturality. I quote, "We should no longer speak of enculturation, but of the meeting of cultures or interculturality." End of quote. But why? Why is such an assertion of then Cardinal Ratzinger? For him, enculturation presumes that a faith is stripped of culture, is transplanted into a religiously indifferent culture, whereby two subjects formerly unknown to each other meet and fuse. For him, such a notion is artificial and unrealistic, for there is no such thing as faith devoid of culture, or culture devoid of faith. From this, let me propose that interculturality or intercultural theology should be considered as a dimension of mission in our time. It should be seen as a response to Pope Paul VI's challenge of evangelization of cultures in the document Evangelii Nunciandi number 20, published in 1975. While enculturation was the paradigm of culture evangelization in those periods, we suggest that interculturality should complement this idea of enculturation. Why? Because enculturation was conceived as a response to the challenge of monocultural evangelization after the post-colonial era, while interculturality is conceived as a response in a multicultural setting of our time. Enculturation then was an approach or a paradigm during the post-colonial period, while interculturality is more fitted to our postmodern period. And enculturation, while it reflects the spirit of Gentes, interculturality, on the other hand, reflects the spirit of Gentes. Gentes is a movement from one place to another to the people, while in Gentes, mission is done with and among the people. In the context of our presentation, we also would like to propose that interculturality is in the service of communion, the ecclesiology of communion, which is the spirit or the ecclesiology proposed or initiated, ushered in by the Second Vatican Council. And in this sense, the broader horizon of interculturality is communion. But this communion is based on unity, not as uniformity, but unity in diversity. It is for this reason that the process of contextualization or contextualized theology will help the Church achieve communion through interculturality, or through, in the academic side, intercultural theology. And therefore, interculturality in this sense should be seen in the service of theology. A theology that proposes an encounter with the culturally other. A theology that proposes the importance of looking or seeking the other face of God in the other, and thus showing the world the other face of the church, the other face of theology, and the other face of consecrated life. With this, mission inter gentes through interculturality can help us transform our way of theologizing, especially in our multicultural and globalized world. Let me conclude my sharing with these thoughts. Pope Francis is clear when he said, "We must walk united with our differences. There is no other way to become one. It is the way of Jesus. Just as Jesus crossed the threshold of various boundaries in his time, the church today is beckoned to do the same. In doing so, the church becomes sensitively attuned to the work of the Spirit in the resounding symphony of communion. It leads the church to walk in joint pilgrimage with and discern the Spirit at work in various peoples with their diverse cultures and religions. Missio inter gentes is the way forward."